All right, welcome to the last, at least for now, video in this Writing an AI series from the ESU Coordinating Council. And I'm so excited to have the group that we've got together here to have a conversation today over really just kind of our thoughts on the future of writing and AI. And the reason we wanted to go here is because the advice up to this point in the previous videos in the series have really tried to think about where we are at this time and what strategies or approaches or conversations we can consider having in the classroom in support kind of today and tomorrow. And I don't want to say that the things that we're going to bring up during our dialogue here don't have that kind of applicability, but maybe these conversations be a little bit more on the cutting edge of where we're headed next, and then also think in the context that we don't currently operate within. So why, it's good to have your head up looking that far down the road, but you don't necessarily live in that reality yet. And so I understand that our present standards are the ones that we have to adhere to. And so let's have a chat, though. Let's kind of like think into that future, because will the standards change? Of course they will. They always have, whether AI has been there or not. And so I'm really grateful today to have Paul Darvasi joining us. And he's from Montreal, Canada, and is a longtime colleague and friend. And so I've appreciated getting a chance to collaborate with him. You can listen to Good Life EDU podcast. We've done several episodes. And Mike Kentz from down in Savannah, Georgia, who is also been on the podcast and been in previous videos in this series. And so, Paul, Mike, welcome to this conversation. And let's just dive right in. I'm going to actually throw things over to Mike here first. When you start to think about this kind of the future of writing in AI, as somebody who was in the classroom as recently as last semester, kind of walk us into that world.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some solutions to the sort of problem of AI and the essay writing process that are short term, they work really well. For example, having your students write the entire essay or a major portion of it right in class while you're with them to maintain the integrity of the assessment. That's great. But I think longer term, that's just simply not going to be enough. We have to go a little bit further and get more creative and go deeper. And so one of the things that I experimented with last year was the idea that we could teach, I'll call it good writing, for lack of a better phrase. We could teach good writing in the context of communicating with AI, that we actually, asking a good question of an AI system is actually a writing skill in the same sort of cognitive process. And so one thing that I think writing teachers can start to think about is, can you teach good writing via the chat interaction itself? And a lot of people jump to sort of like prompt engineering, and I think that is a decent place to start. But if you take that word engineering out, it becomes much more palatable to writing teachers. And if you think about it, we never say that we write it, or excuse me, we don't say that we engineer a thesis statement, right? We write a thesis statement, and that's what you're doing in the chat. And so if you teach them good communication, you can subsequently grade that communication as well. You can look at the transcript and say, hey, students, I'm actually going to evaluate. I want to see thorough communication. I want to see critical thinking in the way that you're talking to AI. And that becomes another way of assessing their thinking and building good writing skills.
Yeah, and I think it's important for me to bring up here, too, that we are all, I'll say this, you're not saying this, recovering English teachers here from our different roles. And so hearing that, Paul, would you like to maybe expound upon what Mike shared there and how that lands with your perception of teaching and learning?
Yeah, first I'd like to say that I love that you're challenging this idea of prompt engineering. That's never sat well with me, and I think that prompt writing is the way to go. And just to build on what you're saying, I think that as a person who uses AI almost every day in my workplace for writing reports or helping me review things that I've done or synthesizing ideas, one thing I realize is you have to be very precise in what you ask the AI to do. You have to give very clear directions or you don't get the outcome that you're looking for. And that's an incredible skill to learn. So when you're creating prompts or students are creating prompts, it's a real test to make sure that you are communicating effectively, because the AI will tell you if you're not communicating effectively, if you're not using your words precisely. So there's definitely something that can be leveraged there when you are using AI for the purposes of clear communication in your classroom.
So true. And I know, Mike, this is something you and I can't remember when I visited about, also just this idea that teachers are sort of uniquely equipped with the skills necessary to demonstrate that kind of like prompting interaction. You want to take a second to share on that idea?
Yeah, effective communication in an AI chat, as Paul sort of alluded to, it can exist in a lot of different varieties and formats. There's no one way to work with an AI system or a chat bot. And that's why, looking at a whole transcript is a more effective way of actually giving them feedback. Because if you're just looking at one prompt, you're not seeing the whole story. And we as English teachers know how important that whole story is. And what I've seen when I've looked at some of my students' transcripts, and even other adults, I've kind of done it with other adults too, is sometimes a narrative actually develops and you really see your students thinking on the page, what's going on inside their brain as they solve a problem. And so what you are trying to teach them, to go back to, prior to grading the chats, if you're going to teach them effective communication, like Paul said, you've got to teach them a lot about context, a lot about reflecting beforehand. What is your purpose or objective? Make sure you're really clear on that before you start. You don't necessarily have to have a 1,000 word prompt at the beginning, but if you've reflected and you're really clear on what you're trying to get to at the end, then usually those iterative prompts that come later in a chat interaction are more effective, because you've got the idea in your brain and you're just, you're playing with it. You're having a conversation, you're brainstorming, and you're seeking the best possible outcome, which ironically, when we start talking to chatbots, a lot of times we think we know what the best outcome is, but it isn't until the end of the chat that we realize maybe there was even another option. And so that, again, gets back to this communication and critical thinking, brainstorming skills that we get in a collaborative engagement.
Wow, so much to kind of tease apart there. One of the things that I want to bring up and be consistent with this across, as this is a resource that, at least at this time, if we talk about students interacting with AI chatbots like a ChatGPT or Gemini, unless that's something that is kind of enterprise version to your district specifically, where they do have the opportunity to kind of oversee those student interactions. There are age limits with some of those, but there are also great tools like School AI, for example, that the teacher could tailor a chatbot experience, almost like customize that chatbot, and it is in a space where student information is not necessarily getting directly back like to the chatbot, because the student's identity is not directly identifiable to the chatbot. So anyway, check out the video on that for more, but it's worth saying at this time. And that is a part of the resource that is up here now. And so we'd certainly encourage you to check that out for those references there. And then with that, it makes me kind of start to think a little bit. And the only part that I would maybe impart here as you were talking, I think for so many folks, they're going to want to say, well, it needs to be this or this. It needs to be this or this. And maybe it's more of an and the opportunity to say, let's grade the chats and let's be really thoughtful about that prompting on the front end in terms of the reflective thinking that goes in before we get started and the conversation as it evolves. And what are you going to do with this afterwards? Are we going to be able to assess students through conversations? Are they expected to present this material? And maybe it's not the essay itself that is the only piece that is being scored. Paul, as I see you shake your head there, I guess I'll throw things to you and see what of that kind of lands with you.
Yeah, that really resonates. I've for quite a while now, I feel that calling the class that we call English is a misnomer. I feel that it is better named communication. Right? That's fundamentally our drive. And I think that by doing that, we're decoupling ourselves from the past, because I think that one of the things we have to start looking at is where we're going with all of this, right? Like we're holding on to like, okay, they can't write essays anymore on their computers because they're using chatbots. So I'm going to get them to write by hand. And I think what we're doing there is really just resisting how things change. And the question is, well, is what we're doing better or worse? That's the big question, right? But the answer, unfortunately, is it doesn't matter. It's what's happening. And we have to live with the reality of what's happening, and we have to adjust to that reality. So one of the challenges is, if we want to make our students effective communicators, maybe we have to move beyond the essay. Maybe we have to focus on visual communications or leveraging AI to meet your communication goals, because that's the world of work as it's coming up now, right? That's what's on the horizon. And we should be preparing students for the world that's coming, not the world that we're coming from.
Absolutely. Throwing it back to Mike here. What do you got to say in response to that? I can tell very much in agreement. As am I.
Yeah, no, I love the idea of like pairing visual communication with written communication. For example, Paul mentioned, and a variety of other different strategies where we are going back to Andrew, your terminology, sort of layering the assessment approach. Another way of thinking about it could be thinking about it as a portfolio. I've got 5 or 6 different items in that portfolio that I'm grading that, let's say 3 or 4 of them are process based and maybe 1 or 2 of them are product based. You're going to get a really nice tapestry of your students thinking with that approach. And I will say, as English teachers, especially I think in the younger grades, we've always tried to do this, probably at the university level as well, with things like graphic organizers. And it's not that much of a departure. It's just a different way of looking at the process. And now instead of them drafting their brainstorming on a paper by themselves, they're doing it with a bot that's essentially talking back to them and brainstorming with them. But then that final piece, Paul, I love the visual communication idea. And I think there's a verbal piece too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I know, Paul, you have a lot of really great ideas on this. And I wanted to just say one thing that you can do if you're allowing them to use AI for the essay is, okay, the traditional output, the essay is still going to come to me as the teacher. I'm going to lower the value though. Still important. I still want you to do it, but I know you're using AI and I'm going to lower the value. And now everybody has to come up in front of class and verbally present their essay. No notes, no visual anchor. Not everybody wants, but I did that with my students and I just told them, hey, I know you're not going to remember every detail. I'm not expecting a perfect presentation. Just give me the gist. You got 2 minutes. Tell me what your paper was about. And that way I, as the teacher, can really easily know whether or not my student knows the subject and the topic. So I think that could be very valuable.
Absolutely. I'm such a believer in the value of presenting ourselves orally in a much better way. And it's, most English curriculums across North America put some emphasis on oral communication and listening. And AI can absolutely be leveraged to that end. For example, I give a speech in speech to text. I take the text and put it in AI, and I asked it to evaluate my speech. How could I say it better? How could I improve it? Give me feedback on my verbal habits and oral habits. How do I strengthen my argument? So playing around with these ideas in a really dynamic way can improve the communication landscape outside of kind of these traditional forms that we've become attached to, like the essay. And one of the things that I will say about the essay is the origin of the essay was to test an idea. You would put a hypothesis and then you would test it by putting it through a series of, investigations and critical thinking. But what's happened in modern education is we're so busy with kids, especially learning the recipe of how to write an essay, that the critical thinking is often lost. Like you're rehearsing almost these steps of going through the points, but you're not really making a persuasive argument. So I would say that we've almost lost touch of the true value of essays. And there's an opportunity to recapture that with a little bit of imagination and connecting more legitimately with the relevant forms of communication that are around us. Like, what are the kids doing at home? Let's value those informal spaces. What are they watching on YouTube? What are they doing on social media? How do we leverage those forms to make learning relevant and effective?
Yes. And can I pair that with this idea of also the future of work? Right? Like what are not only they doing now, which I think is always a great thing to consider and creates engagement, all those things, but then where might this go? Which is why we're having this video in the midst of this series. So in that future of work where I'm not even sure the work world has figured out exactly how to leverage these tools yet, Paul, as somebody who you educate, maybe not in education in the traditional sense in your 9-to-5 work, though I know you still have your employment through the University of Toronto. Could you kind of speak a little bit here as we bring things to a close to that, how you kind of see that playing out in the rhythms of the work world professionally? And Mike and I will kind of expound upon that maybe too, but let's start with you.
Yeah, so I think that in my experience so far, we have to remember that the AI that we have right now is the black and white silent film of AI, right? Like we also have that, like if this is nothing compared to what's coming down the pipe. And that is both scary and exciting, right? Because what we're doing and what we're fearful of is, it's going to take our jobs. We're going to be, so what that is it's going to change our relationship with work. So one, it enhances. I use AI every day, but I have to check on it. I have to make sure that what it's doing is right. I use it very it doesn't do all my work for me. It just helps me with certain tedious tasks, but that's going to change over time. Let's remember, in the Industrial Revolution, people were working 80 hours a week in miserable circumstances, and now we've gone down to the 40-hour work week. Maybe there's a future with a 10 or 15-hour work week, right? Where we change our patterns, and our life is not about work anymore. It's about family and community participation and mentorship, and it's changing the roles that we have, which may not be a bad thing at all. Like maybe our identities aren't so much around what we do, but who we are. And maybe that is going to make the world a better place, right? We can't hide behind that I'm a lawyer or a doctor. This is who I am. This is how I contribute. This is what kind of a parent I am. This is what kind of a citizen I am. And so there's a lot of positives that could come, but it's going to, I think, dramatically change the way that our society is structured.
Yeah, Mike, where's that land for you?
I love that. That work week thing sounds good to me, Paul. But it makes a lot of sense. I mean, it makes common sense, and it's logical to believe or to see that definitely changes are going to come. And what do they look like is certainly up for grabs, I think. One of the things that I'm kind of focused on, if you sort of extrapolate what we've been talking about with writing in the classroom into the workplace, in terms of getting, I think, to where Paul was just talking about, is we will have some bumpy times where, I'm thinking about the sort of young employee, maybe in their 20s or 30s, or they're just out of college, and they're not going to get the schooling that we are talking about. And so if they are using AI for example, for report writing, and they're not really a domain expert in that particular field, and they're thinking this is great, I mean, it just replaced 10 hours of work or something, and they don't check it, which I think is going to happen, honestly. And I think it's more than likely that we'll have some pretty, unfortunately, some negative consequences from that. Hopefully we learn from it sooner rather than later. And then that AI literacy piece gets moving, and it becomes really normal to think deeply as you work with AI, so that you can have that 10 or 15-hour work week. It's almost counterintuitive. It's like Dr. Norbert Wiener famously said in the 60s that we're going to have to think 10 times harder to make sure we use AI the right way. And it's counterintuitive. People are thinking, oh, this means I have to think less, or you do less boring work, but you think more, you think harder in order to actually, leverage it in that way. So that's kind of how I see it developing.
Dang. Okay. I was going to go here, but I'm going to bring it up. Check out the podcast, because Mike can actually tiptoed up to that idea by the end of it, if I remember that conversation accurately, where we got to that point of maybe this isn't about efficiencies sometimes, and what that can look like. And so we explored that there. And as I said, Paul's been on the pod as well. And yeah, with this, again, we're really just trying to create a space here to think into the future. We understand that standards would have to change, and there are a number of other things that would come down the line, but just really appreciate both Mike and Paul's insights, and would encourage you to explore, if you're just viewing this on YouTube, the full resource and all of the videos in this series, as it kind of is hoping to help bridge that gap between the present and where we might think about going into the future. So Paul, Mike, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate that. And we hope that this resource, amongst all of them, have been really supportive for everyone in moving forward with AI literacy, with writing, student assessment, and communication. And so thanks for being a part of that, guys.
Thank you, Andrew.